Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Asliner from the Dialogue Institute at Austin. We are here with you again with another Meet the Author panel. Previously, we had Dr. Tom Gage talk to us about Gudan's dialogue on education. Today, we have Jim Harrington, the founder of the Texas Civil Rights Project, which is a nonprofit foundation that promotes civil rights and economic and racial justice throughout Texas for low-income people. Mr. Harrington has worked as a civil rights lawyer for 4 decades and was also an adjunct professor of civil rights law at the University of Texas Law School for 27 years. Currently, he is an Episcopal priest. Today, Mr. Harrington and I will discuss his book, Three Mystics Walk into a Tavern. Mr. Harrington, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so let's just dive straight into the book.
Okay.
Can you walk us through how this book came to life?
Yeah. So the title, of course, is Three Mystics Walk into a Tavern. And tavern in those days that we're writing about, the 1300s, was actually sort of like a B&B, that kind of thing. But I was actually at a happy hour with Sid Hall, who's a Methodist minister here in Austin, and we were getting into this conversation about how it is that we see certain times of history that there's a confluence that happens, right? For example, we started with the civil rights movement, that there was this sort of international confluence. So this movement happened different places for different reasons. And then the more we talked, we started talking about that this was also experienced with spiritual leaders, mystical spiritual leaders at roughly the same time in history. We looked at Meister Eckhart. We also looked at Rumi and Moises de Leon in Spain. They're all in different places. They're all in different religious traditions, but they all have sort of the same message. And they all sort of move in the same way with how they look at their organized religions that they represent, and where they end up in terms of their mysticism, their idea of union with God, and how it's fascinating that their ideas are so similar. So the more we talked, the more we thought, well, this would make a great book. And we started kidding around because, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of books written about these mystics that we're talking about. So how do we do it in a way that it would appeal to younger people or people that aren't reading in mystical traditions? And how do we also bring in other mystical thinkers that are outside of that time period we were looking at? So we ended up saying, well, why don't we have a meet at a tavern in Venice owned by Dante, who himself was a mystic, and carry on a conversation. And then we can bring in mystics from the past, that show up. And same thing with mystics from the future. We had mystics from the future show up and engage in these conversations. And so the framework of that was a discussion with Moises de Leon, Rumi, and Meister Eckhart. And then at different times, we'll have other people show up at the tavern and join in the conversation. So it was really it was a lot of fun to write it. But today, when I was going back over the book, I really understood, for me, how much of a spiritual experience it was also to write about these other folks. And I think part of what had happened, I had been involved in the dialogue movement, his Met movement for a while, and had come to sort of understand some of the Sufi mysticism that we see in that movement. And of course, Rumi's a very important part of that. And so I think that also kind of piqued my interest in doing this. So I just, Sid and I said, let's do it. And he wrote part of the book and I wrote part of the book, and I really, really enjoyed doing it. It was a great experience.
Yeah, reading it was also amazing. I had never read a book like that. and I wasn't familiar with mysticism all that much, but reading it was very easy and straightforward, which I really appreciated.
Yeah. So you say you weren't familiar with mysticism, and I think that's a lot of what a lot of people will think, that this sort of sounds like a weird term, right? But really, it's about how do you, what's the way you go about having a union with God, right? And that's really what this is. And how do we get there, or what do we do so that God can facilitate that union, right? So I think a lot of people practice that, or understand that, or have experiences like that. But this was a way of kind of, I think, affirming those experiences, but also kind of focusing it and helping people look at what other mystics have done in their life and what their points were. We also wanted to make sure to make the point um, that even though we have three men involved, that mysticism is not limited to gender, right? In fact, in the book, you'll see we bring in all kinds of women mystics to talk as well, who also influenced these guys, that had a lot of influence on these men. But we also wanted to, a key component of mysticism, and this is a little bit contrary to popular understanding, a key component of mysticism is action, social action, right? Out of that relationship that happens with God, the next part of that is what's your relationship with people in the community, right? Because just as we try to open ourselves so that God be in us, that happens also with everybody, right? And as God is in relationship with everybody, including us, and we are part of the universe, and the universe is part of us, that there's a social dynamic there that the mystics are very clear that it has to be part of it has to be a step in this mysticism, in this relationship with God. Even for the people who are monks, in monasteries, who are removed from day-to-day life, their job is really to be praying for us out in the community, right? It isn't that they just have their own individual relationship with God that they work on, but that relationship also extends to the larger community. So as they're trying to have a spiritual relationship with God, they're also having a spiritual relationship with us as part of that community. And that was something we really wanted to emphasize, I think, for the people who were going to read the book.
So there are two types of mysticism, and this book is centered on apophatic mysticism.
Yeah.
Could you break this down for us? What does it mean?
Yeah. So this is the key. The definition here is the key to mysticism, right? So there are two traditions in spiritual thinking, and this applies to all religions, all faith-based, all faiths, right? This is a commonality. So there are two things that can happen, two different approaches. The apophatic is emptying yourself out, learning how to empty yourself out, learning how to let God come into you, and learning how to work in that relationship with God. And by doing that, you're pushing everything you try when you're praying, to push everything out and be still, to be silent, to let God act in you, right? And as the mystics say, this becomes a very intense and in fact, at some point, some of the mystics talk about this as being almost an erotic kind of relationship, because the love is so intense. The cataphatic approach, and I started off with this years ago, and now I understand that this is probably not the best way to go. But the cataphatic approach is that you yourself are taking the steps. So traditionally, the first step was meditation. And then when you thought you were good enough at meditation, then you moved on to contemplation. And when you thought you were good enough at contemplation, then you moved on to what was called the unitive stage. But those are all defined by reality. right? And there's steps that we're taking. When I say defined by reality, we're assuming that if we do this, that this is all there is to do. So cataphatic can be really good in getting you to the point where you move into the next stage. But by itself, it doesn't get you there. So a lot of organized religion is in the cataphatic stage, right? In that it brings us along in terms of its tradition and its prayers and its way of thinking and its culture, all of which is good, all of which is good. But the thing is to go beyond that to the apophatic. The idea of religion ultimately is to give you that relationship with God, which will also give you a relationship with the community. So I don't know if that was totally clear, but it really, maybe if there was one short way to talk about this, is that we don't come into relationship with God by what we're doing. No matter how hard we pray or how we pray or what we do, we don't come into relationship with God until we surrender, until we empty ourselves out, get rid of our ego, and let God function, come inside of us. Meister Eckhart, one of the mystics that we talk about, calls us birthing God. We in a sense are birthing God inside of us, right? And all three of the people that we quote, I mean, we have all kinds of sayings from them that make this point. Rumi is probably the most poetic about this. I mean, his poetry is amazing in expressing this apophatic approach in which you surrender the divine flame, as he calls it, inside of us, right? We let that flame burn. Doesn't mean that we give up our individuality. What it does mean is that we're giving up our ego that tries to control, right? And I mean, this is hard. It's really hard to give up our ego. But that's not our individuality. We're all different individuals. We all have a function that God expects of us in building our society, right? And God, I mean, just as we have all kinds of different relationships, love relationships, different kinds of people, different sorts of marriage, men and women all are in different kinds of relationships. The same thing with God. God relates differently with everybody, but God is expecting to relate with us. And then our job is to empty ourselves out so that can happen, so that we can be doing God's work. So it might mean, for example, that instead of going shopping, which we might like to do, we're going to take some food next door to the neighbor. Or we're going to go to a protest about bad wages, like that. So that's where we're going with these two approaches. They're not antagonistic, but we have to understand that they fit together differently, and particularly in each individual's spirituality.
So with apophatic mysticism, and these are phrases that were in the book, unnaming God,
Yeah.
unsaying God. And at first I was confused. So just to clarify, what is meant by this?
So this is pretty fascinating. It kind of blew me away the first time I heard this, right? Because we have this, we name God, right? God is all powerful. God is almighty. God is all knowing. We have all those names. The Quran has a whole 90 some names for God, right?
Yeah.
But what apathetic folks are saying is when we are defining God, we are defining God by a negative in a sense, right? When we say God is all powerful, so what does that mean to be unpowerful? Right? Or we say God is all holy. Well, what's the contrast? What is there? That's implying that there's something else going on when we define something as we humans. This is a problem with us, of course, right? But when we're defining something, we're defining it against something else. And so apathetic people will say, What you have to do is move back beyond that. Take away all the names of God and just let God be in you. It's not to say naming God is bad, right? But we have to understand that's a step. We develop a greater relationship with God when we move beyond God being all powerful and so on and so forth, as we do all the time, right? So that's sort of that unnaming that goes on. And Eckhart says God is nothing. And what he means by that, he hyphenates nothing. So it's N-O-T-H-I-N-G. And that's what his way of saying when we name God, in a sense, we are creating a thing in our mind, right? And he says we have to get beyond that. And the way we get beyond that is through prayer, contemplation, centering prayer, and just sitting and emptying ourselves out so that we get beyond that thing that is there. God is no thing, nothing. Of course, you can imagine how popular that went over with the church.
Yeah.
But you can see the insight. I mean, you really can see what he's saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that God is greater. We can't understand God. And by naming God, in a sense, we're claiming that we can understand God, right? And I think that's part of where he's going with this. And not just Eckhart, all the mystics are like this. I mean, he happens to be the one that did a lot of writing and particularly preaching about this, right? Rumi's the same way when you read Rumi. I mean, this is the same thing, right? I mean, he says that I read a poem Rumi every day, and it's just the same thing. You know, it's like he's saying the same thing. But you can see how that upsets the official religious structures.
Mm-hmm.
So all of them. So Rumi's coming out of course, the Muslim tradition. He's Sufi. De Leon is coming out of the Jewish tradition, and Eckhart's coming out of the Christian. They all have official established religions. And when you tell a religious leader, we don't need you at a certain point, that doesn't cut it with the religious leader, right? I mean, we're human beings. We like to hang on to our institutions. And so that's why all three of these people, and particularly Eckhart more than anybody else, really had a very difficult time with the established church or established religion at that time, right? And you can read Eckhart, he does not put down established religion, but he says that is only a step to union with God, right? And of course, the churches or religious leaders don't like that. They want to be the ultimate authority. I mean, that's what we are as humans, right? We know that's not right, but that's the way we function.
So, can we say that the unnaming God that these mystics did is why mysticism has been viewed as heresy?
Oh, yeah, totally. Right. Totally. Yeah. You know, and of course, heresy is usually defined by the people who are holding the power,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so one of the things that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we tried to do was to make sure we brought in women in mystics into this, right? And there was a movement in the Middle Ages that affected a lot the thinking of Eckhart, and that was called the Beguine movement.
Mm-hmm.
And these were communities of women who lived together in community. They were mystics. They were not nuns, but they lived together in community, and they did work in the community. So not only did they pray and live a life like that of in union with God, but part of that then was to go out in the community and feed people or take care of them. In those days, of course, there was no safety net, as we call it these days, right? People were very poor and dependent on that. Well, the church, the official church, became very upset with this because these women were operating outside of the structure of the church, right? They weren't nuns. They weren't controlled by the bishops or the Pope. They were operating on their own. And they were clearly models for the community. I mean, these were good women living in community. And there were a lot of them. There were a lot of these communities around Europe, particularly northern part of Europe. And so people will look at them and see that their spirituality, right? And then it's like, well, what's going on with the church in this regard? And so the church then persecuted them, the Beguines. In fact, some of them, one of them we talk about, particular, Marguerite Portrait was executed by the church, basically for heresy. Even though you look at their lives, there's nothing heretical about them, right? I mean, they're living, if they're Christian and they're living according to Christian values, they're following the message of Jesus. There's no doubt about it. But they were doing it outside of the church in a way that the hierarchy did not like. And so that's how they became heretics. And in reality, the real heretics here are the church, right? For executing people that are doing the work of the gospel. But they did suffer a lot. They were actually around, I think, about 200 years, and the church finally suppressed them. There's still some Beguine communities now, but nothing like they were. But they had a big impact on the thinking of Eckhart, right? Their kind of spirituality, their mysticism had a big impact on his thinking as well. So they really accomplished a lot by their existence as a community.
So mysticism is personal. It's your personal spirituality and how close you feel to God. And then, like we've been discussing, there is organized religion. And in the beginning of the book, there's a discussion about the number of people feeling spiritual but not religious in our society. And so, what do you attribute that to?
So I think there are a lot of things that are going on in that. I think one of the things that happens in many regards is that I'll talk a lot from the church perspective because that's where I am, right? And but I'm sure this is true in some degrees with all the other faith groups. So I think what happens is that number one, the faith groups don't learn how to talk to younger people, right? In a way that's meaningful to young people. Young people have a different way of looking at life, different way of thinking. I mean, that's our common human experience throughout all the centuries, right? And so part of that is, how do we relate to that? How do we take that fundamental message in a way that they get it? Because I think what happens is that the churches try to say, you have to do it this way. And you have to do it this way, and otherwise it's not going to work, right? Instead of trying to take that message in a way that younger people interpret, can get meaning from it. I mean, there are a lot of young people that, as you say, will say, I'm spiritual but not religious, which means they're unaffiliated with a church or faith group. And then some of them actually meet in community on Sundays and have their own worship, right? Which is pretty interesting. I think the other thing, frankly, that happens is you see the hypocrisy of the church. You know, that if you look at the church as an institution in the last period of our lives, 50 years or whatever you want to look at, you see a lot of hypocrisy, right? You see in the United States religious groups supporting things that I consider to be very unchristian, right? And if I think that way, I know there are a lot of people that think that way. And if that's the model of Christianity, then why belong to it? Right? Why should I belong to it? I don't believe that. And then you see a lot of internal scandals, the whole thing of sex abuse that's gone on in a lot of faith traditions. That drives a lot of people away. And then if you're in some religious communities where women are a second, that hold second position, inferior position, that's not consistent with how a lot of people think. And so why would you want to belong to that religious organization or faith group if it's excluding people? Because that's contrary to your values. So I think it's a very, very, very mixed bag. But I can tell you what's happening is I don't think any religious group, any church is doing a very good job right now of adapting to this. And it's part of the reason we wrote the book, is to say, look, you grew up in this particular church. You may not agree with it. You may not like it. You may be at odds with some of the people that are there or some of the traditions, but there is part of that that's still good. I mean, what has that church carried on for 100 years or 200 years or 500 years or 1,000 years, whatever, in terms of prayer, in terms of ritual, in terms of understanding that you can take from that and make that part of you. It's sort of what we say in English, right? You have this saying, this bizarre saying about don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's sort of a way of looking at what we were saying. I don't know where some of these English phrases come from in England, but I can't imagine. But anyway, whatever. We have that phrase that we use from England, but that I think that's what the situation is, and I see it. I talk to fellow clergy people, and our kids are outside of the tradition, right? And you ask them why, and you get sort of the answers like I'm telling you, right? So anyway, that's sort of, I hope puts a little bit of light to your question.
Yeah, I think going back to mysticism, and what makes your book so appealing, I mean, because I'm a young person, right? And so it's appealing to me because I realize that I I can live. So yeah, there's a difference between the collective, the organized, like let's say the mosque or the masjid, the church. But then there are the fundamentals of the religion that you believe in. And so you can take those and I guess distance yourself, but you're still close to God in your own way.
Yeah, and I mean, and I may be wrong but my sense is that the Sufi movement within Islam does this. I have that feeling. At least the people that I know, and of course I know a lot of Christians that's their view too, right? And but that's right. I think you hit it right on the head, right? I think and that's really what we wanted to do with the book, and to make it entertaining, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why we have all kinds of weird stuff. People showing up or sitting at the next table or coming over their gondola, right? That kind of stuff. Yeah. But it was to be able to make the points that we did and through the dialogue. So we have them carrying on this night-long dialogue. We have Rumi, of course drinking tea because he's Muslim. Eckhart is drinking beer because he's German. And De Leon is drinking wine because he's from Spain, right? But so we throw things in like that. Or what kind of food are they eating at a particular time, right? We put stuff in like that just to kind of make it interesting. What's really interesting about tavern and drinking and wine is that even though Islam doesn't allow it or permit it, that the Islamic mystics always are talking about drinking and getting drunk, right? In this ecstasy. I think that's very fascinating. In fact, the opening part that we have from Hafez is talking about drinking, right? Wine being part of that mystic. They're not advocating going out and drinking here, but what they're doing is they're equating this with that the intensity with that mystical experience is what they're doing, right? But I think that's interesting. So when we of course we presented our book to different Muslim groups, that we always would say, now, in case you're objecting to this, here's a couple pieces of poetry from Rumi, just to kind of put it in perspective. But I think that's interesting how they, that you have that trying to equate our experience to try to say this is what the union with God is like. So we also talk, as you probably know, a lot about the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, right? That's very erotic, and will be even more so in the New Translation I hear. And the church originally, and the Jewish folks didn't want to put it in the Bible, because it doesn't say anything about God. And so they finally put it in because someone said, well, Solomon wrote it. Well, that's probably not true, but that was a way to get it in. And so next thing they're trying to talk about, well, they say this the Jews would say this reflects God's love for Israel. Christians would say this reflects Jesus' love for the church. But Rumi would say, and De Leon would say, and Eckhart would say, this really reflects our relationship, that intense, intimate relationship that individuals can have with God. That's what this is really about. Just because the churches think it's a little raunchy, it's still describing our the intensity of our relationship with God. Particularly some of the women mystics, and particularly, were very, very. You read their stuff. And it's very much, you would call it erotic in describing their relationship with God. And of course, we are in a Puritan country, and we don't talk like that, right? We get embarrassed. But that's how they're translating the intensity of that experience with God. So it's pretty interesting. And these are the women mystics who lead the way on this, and I'm sure that causes raised eyebrows with some of the men, but that's the way it goes.
So now I want to dive into the actual conversation that the three mystics are having
Okay.
at the tavern. So they talk about various views on God, religion, society, and justice. Could you walk us through each of their respective views on these topics?
So what we did is we picked out 5 topics to write on, right? That we thought would be the most important in our day and age to write about from our perspective, right? And so so in these dialogues that go on, we have them discuss each of the topics. And then we have them, what you will see in each of these is that there is a commonality that all 3 of them have in their particular views, right? But some of it we have to get them to say, put words in their mouth, right? That they may be talking about earlier mystics or mystics that happened after them, even into the 20th century, right? To get them to make their point. There's nothing that we have them say, in our view, that's inconsistent with how they think. But sometimes, especially when you're dealing with women, you're dealing with a male patriarchal society at that time, right? So we want to make sure that when they're talking, that they're moving outside of those structures. And so like when we have the group show up that was at the plaza in Mexico City, and all of a sudden they show up in the in the tavern to have the conversation. They're all Jewish. They're not always Jewish. They're not all Jewish women, but it's a group of women who show up, and so that's how we kind of bring these topics in a way that we can express them in a way that that for us is not inconsistent at all with where these three particular men were in their own thinking, or we have expanded a little bit beyond that for them. So I don't think we did anything that they would not have said after talking with each other or with their visitors, right? And I think probably, and when I said this, a male patriarchal society, that also means in what was written in those days. I'm sure that Meister Eckhart had a much easier job getting his stuff published than the Beguines did, even though they did write. And there's some really wonderful works that we have. Marguerite, that I mentioned earlier, has a beautiful book that's considered to be one of the best books on mystic spirituality, right? But you know, you got all of that working against them, and that's the point that the Mexico City group makes when they move over to Venice. I love that one line. I think as Judith says, "Well, we're sitting here, and you all are in period dress." I thought that was pretty. You know, it was a lot of fun writing the book.
So we've discussed a lot about the patriarchy, and then also these lesser known female mystics. I found that the dialogue between the gentlemen was very open-minded in contrast to the tradition then, but even now,
Mm-hmm.
about, you know, a woman's place in religion. How do you think Rumi, Eckhart, and De Leon would view feminism today?
I think they would. I think they would be all for it. I don't. I think at the end of the day, for them, there's not really a distinction between men and women in spirituality, right? I mean, I honestly believe that the way they were thinking, and you know, what's interesting is so De Leon and Eckhart actually spent a lot of time talking about the feminine side of God, right? So Eckhart, let me start with De Leon first. So he's coming out of this tradition, Kabbalah tradition, in which God has two sides, a masculine side and a feminine side. So God, in the masculine side, kicks the people out of the garden, right? Adam and Eve. But the feminine side of God, Shekinah, goes with them to protect them, even though they have disobeyed, showed pride. The feminine side of God still has that compassion, and it's that part of God that's with the Israelites when they're in the desert, right? That's the feminine side of God, Shekinah. You know, it's not that they're two gods, but they're, you know, it's like with any person, right? I mean, in fact, some of the earlier women mystics would refer to God as mother, which makes total sense, right? I mean, God is not just a male. Actually, God is beyond that. The Apophatic say we're all beyond that, you know, but when we're talking about this, in order to help get people to think, you know, in fact, some of the prayers that we do these days, we say God, Father, and Mother, right? To make sure that it's not just, and so you see the same thing in the Bible, the Hebrew part of it, which the Christians call the Old Testament, in wisdom, the book of wisdom. there appears to be, the way that dialogue goes, that wisdom is sort of the feminine side of God in the creative process. So what happens, I think, to come back to your question, is that when men are writing about these, they sort of take on a different meaning, right? Men, patriarchal males, are not going to like some of this stuff, or just don't understand it, simply don't understand it, right? And so a lot of this gets submerged. And only now, fortunately, do we see this start coming out. You know, the great woman mystic, Arab mystic from Iraq, Rabia, who is about 3-4 centuries before Rumi, also has very passionate poetry about relationship with God. And we know that Rumi picks up some of this from her, right? And he knows that. I mean, you read Rumi, there is no way on earth you could say that Rumi would be anti-feminist. You just can't, or any of them, because they're beyond that. For them, it's the individual person in relationship with God. And you can relate to God no matter who you are, and God will relate to you in God's way, which is beyond relating to us as a man or a woman or whatever, right? It's beyond that. That's where we go with this sort of apophatic mysticism, is to let those structures go, and just, what is that relationship that what's the fire in our heart, as Rumi would say, let that fire burn.
So mysticism is for everyone. Doesn't matter what gender you are, your wealth, your status. It's for everyone. What would be some advice that Rumi, Eckhart, and De Leon would give us today if we wanted to follow in their path?
I think the fundamental thing that you would get from them is to keep at it. Keep on that journey. You know, it's very, we're humans, right? So we carry a lot of baggage with us. But, you know, when you're we typically call this centering prayer now, where you sit in the morning, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe, and then maybe some other time during the day, and just try to empty out your thinking, just your distractions. That's what it is at the end of the day, is distractions, right? That's not an easy practice. I mean, all of the mystics talk about that. Rumi talks about it in his poetry. That is not easy, because you're waiting for that flame to burst out, right? Man, I'm in union with God, you know. Well, good luck. They say
3 threats of mysticism that's also discussed in the book.
Yeah.
How does someone not fall there?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and that's a hard practice. You know, it's really a hard practice. And it's like anything that we do as humans in habit, right? We do it over and over and over again, and we get better and better and better at it, right? So, you know, whatever you want to take, like in writing, we begin to write, it's not very good, right? I'm not talking about handwriting, but or you could, I suppose, but you get better and better at it. Or cooking, you get better and better at it. Whatever it is that you do, driving, you know, playing football, that habit thing. And what it does, if you think about it, what it really does is that it helps us move to the next step. And then we get to the next step, then we can see what the next step is. And then we can see what the next step is. We don't see it clearly from the beginning, right? And that's why everybody talks about you got to have practice here. I mean, you got to do it, and then you grow into it, right? It's not easy. at all. But on the other hand, it's not, dreadful. It's just something to work on. And you see the benefit of it. I mean, I think if you talk to anybody that consistently does centering prayer, for example, or contemplation, they will tell you how it's changed their lives. How they now understand their religious tradition differently and better from their viewpoint. So let's take it. You took a book of the Bible or the Quran, whatever you wanted to do. Take a chapter, and if you're on the journey, every year you read that chapter or that book, it will mean more to you, and you will understand it better. Because these people who write this stuff, we call them inspired, right? They're basically mystics. I mean, they really you read the prophets, Muhammad, right? They're basically mystics. And so what they're writing, we don't understand the first time that we read it. It may sound, oh, that's beautiful. Oh, that's wonderful. And we go back a year later and we go, wow, I have a whole different understanding of this. It's even better than what I thought it was a year ago. So when I'm looking at the book today, that was 5 years ago, I'm looking at it, I'm going, I actually understand this a little bit better than when I wrote about it. And that's progress, right? But it means, it just means you have to stick with it. So Teresa of Avila, one of the premier women Christian mystics, has these experiences with God, right? Relationship. And I think I'm sure this is in the book. But in reality, for all her praying that she does, probably a nanosecond was that experience. So she may have prayed for hours before and after, but her actual experience of union with God, we would say a nanosecond, right? But it was such an experience that she understood what she's writing, to what to write going forward for us to describe that experience, how she got there, right? So I think that's something that we have to understand, is that getting into this practice of mysticism and living in mysticism does not raise us up to heaven, on a cloud. We're human. And part of our job is to be in relationship with God and in relationship with everybody. And that takes a lot of experience. How I might be in relationship with my neighbor today, hopefully, will be much different and much better next year as I work through this process. And I think that's the message from the mystic. I think that's the message they put on the table today, is that none of this happens overnight, but you have faith that we're in that journey that you're taking and that you'll get there. And that's how you find God at the end of the day.
So could we say mysticism is kind of like a spiritual skill? It's something that you constantly work on. And I don't know, maybe you never reach the epitome of it, but you work for it.
So what if we called it, yes, I think the thrust of what you're saying is right. Maybe what if we called it a journey? And on that journey, sometimes we have to kick the stones out of the way when we're going up the path. Sometimes we have to kick the sticks out of the way, right? Sometimes we have to walk around the puddle, right? I think, to me, that's a little, for me, I mean, everybody gets their own framework, but I think for me, that's a little more helpful, because I know I'm never going to get whatever perfection is. I don't know what it is. I have no clue what it is. But I'm sure I'll never be there. But my duty right now to God and to my fellow folks around is to be on that journey. That's my job. That's my duty. if I'm going to be in relation, if I'm going to build, if I'm going to get to that, so maybe that journey. So let's say you're every day that the view you get of the end of that journey where you're going, the garden or whatever, the mountains, whatever you like, or the desert, whatever you like, gets clearer and closer every day, right? That's the way it should be happening, I think.
Yeah, that is beautiful. You said you wanted to show.
Yes, let me show you this slide that I thought, well, I'm not really big in doing a lot of PowerPoint stuff, but I thought this one quote from Rumi was good. So I copied it. So let's see if I have the skill here to pull it up. There it is. This is from one of his poems. Can you see that? Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. So let me go through that. This is from, and what's interesting about the title, this is the title of this, In the Arms of the Beloved, right? So Rumi says, I tried to find God on the Christian cross, but he was not there. I went to Muslim Kaaba, I don't know if I'm saying that right, in Mecca, but God was not there either. I went to the old Jewish synagogue and the Hindu temple of idols, but I couldn't find a trace of God anywhere. I questioned the scholars and philosophers, but God was way beyond their understanding. I then looked deep into my heart, and it was there where God dwelled that I saw him. God was nowhere else to be found. So that's the understanding, right? That all of these different religions that he mentioned are only steps. But at the end of the day, God is inside of us when we let God come inside of us, when our ego is not blocking it, right? And Rumi, all of them, all the mystics are talking about getting rid of the ego, just letting go of everything. God will come in, and then you'll know what to do in that relationship, right? But I thought this is really good because I know, I'm sure you do, that most religions claim that they are the only religion, right? And if you're not part of that religion, tough luck. Either now or in the future, tough luck. I mean, that's the way I grew up, right? If you weren't, I grew up as a Catholic, and I was told if you weren't baptized in the Catholic Church, you're going to hell. Well, I don't think God functions that way anymore. I don't think that anymore, right? And I think that's what Rumi is saying. That's not anybody who's making that claim isn't representing God. And you can see why organized religion does not like him, right? I mean, you know, this pretty, you think about this, pretty tough language in a sense, right? If you're looking for God, God is not on the Christian cross. God's going to be inside of you. And that, or should be inside of you. You know, you got to open that up to be in relationship with God. That's not to say any of the, again, I want to repeat, it's not to say the traditions are bad and that they shouldn't be respected and they shouldn't be part of our lives. They should. But at the end of the day, they're not the ultimate goal, right? They're not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is the relationship with God. And that relationship means that we're going to be an individual relationship and also in relationship with our community because we're all one, you know? God brings us all together. We're all joined by God, and we all are joined in God. So that's where everybody should be heading on this path that I was talking about. But I love this quote, so that's why I'm sharing it. But with Rumi, I mean, you could get 100 quotes. We could have spent the whole hour quoting Rumi. He's amazing. He is an amazing poet, as Rabia was, just an amazing poet. I think what's hard about Eckhart, I mean, he's got a lot of great ideas, but he writes them as theology books or in sermons, right? Rumi has a way of writing this stuff in poetry that people get right away when you read it. I'm sure if Rumi was alive today, and I think we put this is in the book, I know, Rumi would be very upset with the way people use his poetry. Because the way that people use his poetry now are love messages that we use for each other. For Rumi, that wasn't what was going on. He was talking about his love relationship with God, right? That's what he was talking about. But we've sort of destroyed or undermined that message, because now we have Hallmark cards with all of these Rumi messages on them. You know, they're beautiful, and that's not to say they shouldn't be used, but we don't understand that when we forget that his whole purpose in writing was to build that relationship with God, and that was what he was telling us. He's writing his poetry for us. He's not just doing it for himself. He's writing it for us, right? And that's what he's telling us. This is how you do it, and this is what you will find. This is a way that relationship is going to look like. It's beautiful stuff that he wrote for us. He's not writing it for the Hallmark cards. But I know we have that in the book. We made that point.
So concise, like you said, it's very easy to understand what he wants us to understand. Actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this poem in particular, for me, sums up mysticism perfectly.
Yeah. Right. So, you know, you look at that. I mean, we talked about the religions there, but also I question the scholars and philosophers, but God was way beyond their understanding. So he's not saying at all what they're writing is no good. It is. He's saying it's not adequate. And so that's sort of, we go back to the difference between the cataphatic and the apophatic, right? So the cataphatic folks would be inclined to think that they would be able to explain everything in their writings, scholars and philosophers, right? Rumi's saying you go beyond that. What they're saying is fine, but it's not enough. At the end of the day, it's about, where do I find God? Where does God find me? Right? And that's in our hearts. What he would, in our being. I mean, he's not, you know, he's talking about our being, who we are. It was a lot of fun writing this. I learned a lot. But
like I said, it was really fun reading it as well. And like you said, maybe I was aware of mysticism, or I knew about it, but I wasn't aware. And maybe I did experience something like that, but at the time I didn't know that what I was experiencing was that, because like we said, it's not an experience that happens for a long time. It could be a few seconds.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, they're great Muslim mystics too. I mean, it's just as many. Every religion has the mystics. They're great, right? What I really wanted to come back and say, what I think is fascinating. So we zeroed in on the Abrahamic faiths, right? I mean, we did very little. We did a little bit about Buddha, but we sort of because that's the way we grew up, and that's where our religious traditions are. But so that may be another book for somebody else, you know, to look at Eastern mystics. But what I thought was really fascinating, I'm going to look here, have the part of the book here that I thought was really fascinating, is that the Kabbalah movement, which is Jewish mysticism, comes out of Persia. Because after the temple was destroyed, the Jewish intelligentsia, if you want to call it that, the cultural leaders, basically moved to what we now call Baghdad, right? That was actually the center of Judaism for a long time. And so the Kabbalah movement comes out of there. And then we see some of the leaders of that movement come across the Mediterranean and establish in France, southern France, around Marseille, and then move from there over to Spain. Spain, and the reason I mentioned France is that would be getting the message north to Eckhart and the Beguines. Spain is the whatever you call it, hothouse of the three religions, where the mysticism develops. The great mystical leaders at that time are in Avila, Teresa of Avila, Christian saint, but Moises is there, Moises de Leon. And this is before everybody was expelled from Spain by the Queen, right? If they weren't Catholic. This is a huge loss to Spanish culture. But anyway, before that, so you have all these religious leaders working together, thinking together, listening to each other. Out of that group comes a famous Muslim mystic, one of the most famous, a Sufi master, Ibn al-Arabi, who ends up back in the Middle East, in Damascus, right? And then you see the strengthening of the Sufi movement, So it's interesting how you have the interplay between these three traditions, and you can trace it, watch it geographically happen around the Mediterranean. It's just utterly amazing to me but it shows to me, what it shows is what our premise of the book is that no matter what your religious background is or faith tradition, we all end up in exactly the same place, right? And that same place is union with God and union with each other, around us. So anyway, that was quite eye-opening to me that when I saw that happen, how they are all tied together. Very nice.
Well, that's all the time we have.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Great discussion, clarifying on so many of the confusion that I had.
No.
It was great.
Well, thanks. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking about this stuff because I think when we talk with each other, it helps both of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
A conversation. Well, you're called dialogue, right? There you go. Yeah. Dialogue helps. Mm-hmm. Dialogue is growth. It's growth. Yeah. So thank you. I've out talked my program here, your program.
Thank you so much. We're also approaching the holidays, so I hope you have a safe and joyful one with your loved ones.
Well, thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.
And let's all hope that 2021 will be a better year than 2020 was.
Yes.
And that what's our part? We have a part in making it a better year too. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what these three mystics would say.
All right. Thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
And take care.
You too. Thank you very much.